Good evening and welcome to this week's weekly wisdom webinar series. We are speaking to the ninth tenet of the authentic self model, and that is self-worth and self-value, self-worth and value. Now, of course, before we begin, I would love to please acknowledge the traditional landowners of not only this land, but of course, all lands around the world for their knowledge, their wisdom, their contribution, their innate presence and power that they bring to current society. Thank you. Now, let's get started. Let's commence. Let's get very excited about self-worth and self-value and what this means. Now, we're going to speak to a number of different facets of this today, and predominantly we're going to speak to understanding how to cultivate self-worth and the importance of self-worth in our lives. It is crucial, absolutely crucial. So I plan to finish this webinar today with a series of questions to assist you to begin to truly think deeply about what self-worth means to you. And importantly, why self-worth is so important and having that sense of worth, that sense of value. And we're going to understand the synonyms that that coincide with the term self-worth today as well. So firstly, the first question I want to ask you is, what is your personal currency? Some of you maybe have heard this term before, personal currency. And we use the term currency here because it helps us understand what value we bring to the world around us, to our interactions in everyday life, to our relationships, to the people that we work closely with, to society in general. How are we of service? What value do we possess? Do we have? Do you have that you consider your personal currency? And I'd like you to consider that question. That's a very thought-provoking, deep question the entire way through this webinar. It's critical that we believe in ourselves. So when we're talking about synonyms, we're talking about self-belief, self-confidence, self-love. We can group self-worth in that, or we can rather place self-worth in that group of terms: self-belief, self-confidence, self-love, self-care. Very important to understand that. And it's critical that we actually believe in ourselves. Our survival and our sense of well-being virtually depends on our belief in self, on our capacity, our belief in our capacity. And not only in our capacity, but our potential and our ability to express and actualize physically our potential. But we must recognize, be aware, and take ownership of our potential first. No matter when or where we embark on our journey of discovery, remember, we must tell ourselves how worth it we actually are. Because, my friends, you are the one who is empowered, who is connected, who is responsible, and who really must take charge in establishing self-worth and belief in self. And you are the one who needs to endorse yourself and then project that outwards. You are the one that needs to back yourself up. You are the one that needs to believe in yourself, understand yourself, and connect to yourself. And when we speak to cultivating self-belief, we'll speak to this later, but I want to mention it now. Understanding self is crucial in this phase, in this space. And we'll speak to what that means later on a great deal. Now, the dictionary defines self-worth as the sense of one's own value or worth as a person. And extending on that, it's as a person relative to our socio-cultural, socio-economic, and geopolitical circumstances, era, and current state. However, There are many ways for a person to value themselves, and we're going to address that. We're going to move through that and into that as we progress. And there are many ways that we can assess ourselves and assess our worth as a human being, and we'll discover these later as we continue. And some of these are more psychologically beneficial than others. So to us, they have greater benefit to others. Now, there will be a number of variables that determine the benefit: our cultural upbringing, our general conditioning, our models of reality, the way we move and understand the world, what our highest value and our hierarchy of values and what our purpose is will contribute to assessing the way and the manner that we assess our self-worth in the world. Now, I want to make mention as well as to why this self-worth / self-value tenet is part of the authentic self model. And it's part of that intricate journey towards understanding the authentic self and establishing a powerhouse of authenticity for self. The reason is because we cannot be authentic if we do not believe in ourselves. Now, by attempting to believe in ourselves, by establishing a sense of self-worth and understanding our personal currency, we must move through a process of exploration. We must progress through progressional steps of understanding self. And what that means is we begin to unpack and uncover the entirety of who we are. We begin to unpack and uncover our authentic truth. That encompasses everything that we are. Not only the good or the perceived wonder of self, but also the shadow self. And we'll speak to this later on as well. But we unpack those undesirable traits of self that society generally shuns, and therefore we do as well. And by embracing all of that and moving through that process, because establishing an understanding of self and connecting to one's personal currency is a process. And in that process is where we discover the fullness of who we are. And when we discover the fullness of who we are, guess what? We become authentic. And that's why this tenet is included in this model. And of course, why the authentic self model is part of the sovereign leadership model. Because as part of the sovereign leadership model, we require, in order to lead ourselves in life, we require an ability to believe in ourselves, to understand ourselves, to know our worth, to be a powerful, empowered sovereign leader, not the type of power that is autocratic, not the type of power that is coercive or repressive or ego-based, but the power that is authentic, sincere, of service. If we are to engage in that leadership model and understanding of self, we must believe in ourselves. Remember what we said at the beginning, synonymously, self-belief is in the same group of terms as self-worth, self-value, self-confidence, self-care, self-love. Let's not forget that. And remember that's that question I asked you at the beginning. What is your personal currency? Where do you possess value? What is your value to others, to yourself, to your own personal journey? Keep that in mind, please. Now, often what happens is, and we're going to speak to this in a moment, we're going to speak to the differences between self-esteem and self-worth, and we may as well just jump immediately into that. Yeah. So, although self-worth is often used as a synonym for self-esteem, self-worth should be less about measuring yourself based on external actions and more about valuing your inherent worth as a person, your intrinsic value. And we're speaking to being and doing. I'm going to speak to self-esteem. We actually can't speak to self-worth without mentioning self-esteem, because it's so important to understand the effect that low self-esteem has and where historically it comes from and how we understand that in our lives. In other words, when I'm speaking to intrinsic value, I'm speaking to self-worth is about who we are, not about what we do. Not so much about the actions that we take in a socio-cultural setting, but more about the person that we are. Who are we being internally, and how do we project that? This provides us with a deeper connection, understanding to and of self, and also to others. It also allows us to get very real and very serious about who we wish to be in the world and how we wish to move the world. You see, self-esteem can lead us to psycho-emotional conditions and states such as narcissism and perfectionism. Now, and I'll elaborate as to why in a moment. But let's speak to narcissism and perfectionism for a moment. We become so self-absorbed, and that's a synonym for self-esteem, or so not so much a synonym, but it's grouped in the same category of terms, placed in the same group of terms, where we become so self-absorbed, we lose sight of who we actually are, and we're simply externalizing our actions and globally comparing. Perfectionism is a lost cause. We are never satisfied, we are never content, we are never fulfilled, we never find meaning in our actions. And we're going to speak deeply to meaning and fulfillment later as a way to cultivate self-worth and self-value. We'll speak to that later in great detail. But perfectionism and narcissism, it causes harm to self, to our path, and it causes harm to others. It disorientates us. It relegates others to the sidelines. It ostracizes others, and it ostracizes our authentic self. It hides us further away from the authentic self. We then begin to move through life in unhealthy ways. We begin to engage in shadow movement. And we begin to forget and neglect our true core. See, there's a problem with society's focus on higher self-esteem. The problem is that this focus involves constantly measuring oneself against others. This becomes problematic. Rather than paying attention to one's intrinsic value, we're focusing on what the other person is doing and why we're not as good as them or why we're better than them. And we focus not on the quality of our delivery or the quality of the content that we give to the world, in other words, our personal currency, but rather we focus on just being better than the other. And the reality is our competitive, individualistic and Western culture tells us we need to be special and above average to feel good about ourselves, to find meaning in our lives. But we can't all be above average at the same time. It's a fucking physical impossibility. Let's think of that for a minute. If everybody's above average, then what are we comparing average to if there's nothing to compare it to because we're all above average? See, this is the impossibility. So we're chasing our tails. We're losing our worth. So in this sense, searching for self-worth by constantly comparing ourselves and confusing self-worth for self-esteem and constantly comparing ourselves to others means to always be fighting a losing battle. And to ask yourself sincerely and deeply and profoundly, is that the life that you want to live? Constantly pursuing, constantly chasing in an inauthentic manner. And you're chasing that elusive feeling that is false by nature. It has no grounding. There's always someone more wealthy. There's always someone more attractive. There's always someone more powerful. There's always someone more successful. But what does that mean when we're comparing? And why must we feel the need to compare? Even when we do manage to feel self-esteem for one brief golden moment in time, we cannot maintain that feeling. We cannot hold on to it. Our sense of self-worth bounces around like a ping pong ball, rising and falling in lockstep with our latest successes or failures. So we're basing our sense of well-being and wellness on, are we successful today? Whatever our definition of success is, or are we failing today? Whatever our definition of failure is. And we're going to redefine failure. We're going to redefine fear around failure and what that actually means later on as well, or shortly. You see, success is not simply about reaching an endpoint. I speak to this often. In fact, I shot a video on this today. Success primarily is defined by courage, taking or making the choice, taking the leap, stepping into courage through fear towards an evolving end state, towards a goal or an objective or a state that one wishes to move into and be or even do. But the success primarily comes from engaging in the process and all the teaching, the valuable teaching and the lessons that come along the way. That is what success primarily is. Yes, success is also in part defined by reaching that evolving endpoint or that evolving objective. Because if we set ourselves an objective for 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 36 months in advance, the time that we set that goal, that objective, or that state, that desired state to move into, and the time that we reach that state and assume that we do reach it in that timely manner, we have developed and grown so much if we pay careful attention and if we move careful attention to our circumstances and our inner state, and if we move with a very deliberate intention, that we are ultimately a different person. I mean, biologically we're different. Every 7 Sorry, guys. I think something happened then. It just paused. I hope that's still. It says that it's recording. So, okay, we're back on. It said that it says that it's recording. Apologies for that internet trouble. So I'm hoping that still works fairly well. Yeah, apologies for that. Okay. So we were speaking to mental health and that basing our self-worth on external faculties, external factors outside of our control and outside of who we are, and not intrinsically valuing the worth that we present, our personal currency we present to the world, is actually harmful to our health. Now, self-worth, I mentioned this earlier, self-worth is intrinsically linked to self-love. And this is so important. And we're going to speak to self-love and compassion, self-compassion as well in a moment. And we're going to understand how being compassionate with self, for self, to self, can add tremendous value to our lives. But before we do that, before we go into a deep sense of cultivating self-worth and value, I want to speak to linking self-worth across all 9 areas of life and cultivating a balance, an aptitude, a resilience, a connection, and an effectiveness in these areas is a primary way to cultivate feelings of worthiness for self. So I want to start that cultivation of the sense of self-worth with linking it to the 9 areas of life. Now, in my 9 areas of life model, I have 9 areas of life. So there's the 4 bodies of the human person: the physical, the spiritual, the emotional, and the psychological, mental or cognitive. Same. Then there's 5 additional areas to that. There's social. I'm sorry about this internet connection. There's social, there's relationship, there's family, there's vocation, there's financial. So in this space, I might actually change the internet connection. One moment, please. I think that's important to do because this isn't looking good here. Okay, we're on. I think this is good. I think this is a better connection now, I hope it's a better connection, yeah. We shall see though, upcoming, and hopefully won't have any internet troubles at the moment. Yes, good. So the 9 areas of life. Now, for example, let's just take relationships as one example. Now, relationships in the 9 areas of life covers primarily relationship to self, relationship to an intimate partner specifically, and relationship to earth. They're the 3 main areas that it covers. And in that area of life, we go into great detail of what's required in order to be the best version of self in a balanced, equilibrated manner in that area of life. So when we define ourselves by our aptitude and our balanced perspective, understanding, and movement in each area of life, we become more centered, we become more connected to self, we become more effective in life. Effective being defined by we move through life with greater confidence and we believe in ourselves and we are of greater service and value to others. And this is really the concept of selfish selflessness. It's a beautiful concept. Now, further to that, let's begin to move into cultivating a sense of self-worth and value. How do we do it? Because this webinar is all about value. It's all about, not only this particular webinar is about self-value, but it's about adding value to you, the viewer, adding value to you so that you can learn to connect and understand what's actually required to be the best version of self, to feel worthy, to feel that you are of value to your own path, your own life's journey, and of course, to the journey of those that are special in your life. Introspection is key. This is we'll call this the second point in cultivating self-worth. But introspection is absolutely key. Noticing yourself, challenging yourself, observing yourself closely, and how you function and feel in each area of life across the 9 areas. It's about retrospection, introspection. At the end of each day, do you observe yourself, observe who you are, observe how you behaved. Ask yourself deep quality questions of self, because quality query in life leads to quality outcomes and a quality experience. Are you asking yourself, could I have behaved differently today? Where was I of value today? What were my thought patterns today? What was my emotional self like today? Learn about how the mind actually functions. Understand relationships. Understand the dynamics in particular relationships and why they occur. By reflecting on areas of life. Actually reflecting deeply on areas of life. As part of that introspection, movement is key. Be competent in movement. Feel confidence in your body. Realize your capability. Think about actually self-actualization. So realizing your potential, which is a tenet of the sovereign leadership model. And now when we're talking about learning about the mind, we're talking about the psychology, which is a body or an area of life. When we're talking about movement, we're talking about the physical, which again, these are just examples. These are an area of life. Master these areas. Learn to master these areas by being confident and competent in human movement. Deepen your thought processes around introspective practice, your personal introspective practice. Deepen your attentiveness to self and move with a deliberate intention. Ask specific questions, wanting to understand self with greater efficacy and greater depth. Now, the next point in terms of cultivating self-awareness and self-value is stop comparing. Just stop comparing. It's not easy, but stop. Our society doesn't allow us too much to stop comparing, but you must just stop. Just stop. Challenge your critical inner voice, because your critical inner voice in part is defined and born from our external understanding of the world and societal pressures, sociocultural, familial, externalized peer group pressures. The critical inner voice is like a nasty coach in our heads that constantly nags us with destructive thoughts towards ourselves or others. Now, the inner critic or that inner voice, it comes from a good place. Its intention is actually good, but it comes from the ego, and the ego just wants to remain with what is familiar. So if it's accustomed to speaking in a derogatory, negative manner about self, that's familiar. Familiarity is comfort, and comfort is safety. And the ego wants to be safe. So we must understand that, understand how the mind works, because this internalized dialogue of critical thoughts or inner voices undermines our sense of self-worth and even leads to self-destructive or maladaptive behaviors, which makes us ultimately feel even worse about ourselves. Our self-worth even diminishes more and more. It's just that initial phase of pushing past that pain of the ego, the pain of what's familiar. But then what's unfamiliar becomes familiar because we continue to expose ourselves to that line of thought or that introspective practice or that exposure to new information. We all have a critical inner voice which acts like this cruel coach inside our heads that tells us we are worthless or undeserving of happiness. Not all the time, but there are times, some more than others, of course. Now, this coach is shaped from painful, to give you a bit of an understanding, from painful childhood experiences and critical attitudes that we were exposed to in early in life, as well as feelings our parents had about themselves and that we observed in them. Because remember, as children, we learn profoundly through observation. We're in an alpha state of consciousness. We're highly hypnotic. We're highly susceptible to information coming through to us. It's intense and immense what goes on as a child in terms of absorbing information and life lessons around us, models of reality. Our models of reality are developed as from being a child. Now, while these attitudes can be hurtful over time, they have become ingrained within us. And as adults, we may fail to see them as an enemy, instead accepting their destructive point of view as our own. But with careful introspection and self-analysis and awareness of self, guess what? We look at life very, very differently. And we begin to observe life from a point of power, from a point of clarity, a greater point of clarity. Now, the next point in cultivating self-worth and self-value, and we spoke to this earlier, is self-compassion. And what is this? What is self-compassion? Now, self-compassion actually is one of the tenets of the sovereign leadership model, and being compassionate towards self and, of course, then being able to be compassionate towards others is quintessential in our growth as a sovereign leader, as an empowered sovereign leader. So self-compassion is the practice of treating self with the same empathy, understanding, willingness, kindness, compassion that you would treat a loved one with. So if a loved one came to you and they were struggling, they were hurting, how would you treat them? How would you behave with them? How would you assist them, guide them, talk with them? What language would you use? What would you feel and hear? What would your thoughts be? Think about that. COAL, as an acronym, COAL, is an attitude which means being curious, open, accepting, and loving towards yourself and your experience, rather than being self-critical and harsh, being destructive, coming from fear, coming from constriction. And we'll speak to fear and constriction in a moment when we speak to mindset. But there are three steps to practicing self-compassion. These are very simple steps. And these aren't the only steps, of course, but these are simple steps. Acknowledge and notice your suffering. Own it. Be empowered enough to take ownership of it. Recognize it. Embrace it. Number 2, be kind and caring in response to this suffering. Don't treat yourself harshly that you're not good enough, that you should being a very toxic, destructive word, that you should know better or should be better or should understand better. Remember, step number 3, know this intimately, that imperfection is part of the entire scope of the human experience, and it's something that we all share profoundly. Self-compassion is so important for cultivating self-worth, for engaging fully in the self, understanding self, and connecting openly to self. Next point in cultivating self-worth and self-value. Engage in activity that is in alignment with your highest purpose and your hierarchy of values, so that we actually feel that we're living fully. And we're going to speak to, because this is actually intrinsically linked to the next point, which is around meaning and fulfillment. But let's just speak to purpose and values for a moment. What is your purpose or purposes in life? Why are you here? Now, your why can be ever evolving. Generally, for most people, you'll find that a why is almost quasi-permanent, so to speak. Nothing's permanent per se. The way that you feel about your why today will be, even if it's the same why, will be very different in 50 years' time. It will evolve. It's understanding and your connection to that and the experiences that you have around that purpose and that why. But your purpose and values, when you gain clarity on those, then you start to take action in alignment with that purpose and those values. You feel intrinsically and autonomically, you feel worthy because you're living your truth. You're living authentically? How can you not feel worth? How can you not feel connected deeply? Next point, engage in activity that provides us and that has intrinsic meaning to who we are. You see, here's the key to happiness. The key to happiness is discovering meaning in everyday action and living that meaning through those actions that are in alignment with that meaning. That is the foundation, and fulfillment, meaning and fulfillment. That is the foundation to happiness. And if we are happy, if we are truly, deeply, authentically happy, guess what? We have self-worth. We perceive ourselves and believe ourselves to be truly worthy. What a beautiful place to be. So fulfillment and meaning in our actions are so important. Take an assessment of who you are and where you stand, because this is vital to your ability to function freely in the world. By assessing and recognizing our abilities, we validate ourselves, and we need to be able to do that before anyone else can validate us. If we don't validate ourselves, if we don't back ourselves, if we don't rate ourselves, if we don't believe in who we are, how can we expect others to do the same and validate us as well? It becomes challenging. Next point, mindset. Now, this is crucial. How do you feel about life? Do you have an open, supportive, abundant mindset? Or do you have a closed, rigid, constricted, fear-based mindset? Your mindset will determine how you feel about yourself and the world. And I want to specifically speak to fear and courage here, because having an open mindset or immersing ourselves in an open state of being, so open states are courageous states. And in order to be courageous, there must be an underlying understanding that we respect ourselves, that we back ourselves, that we care about ourselves enough to be open in our postures, to be open in our truth. Whereas when we're stuck in fear, we're closed, we're constricted, we're in closed states of being, we're constricted by nature, we're scared of living our truth, scared of maybe perhaps being ridiculed, being not understood, of maybe perhaps we are scared or fearful of failing, maybe we are fearful of success. It becomes very interesting. But mindset is so important. In particular, open mindsets or courageous mindsets and fear-based mindsets, or open mindsets and closed mindsets. Are we closed to the information that the world presents us? Or are we open, fully engaged, fully present? That's important to understand. Next point, in cultivating self-awareness, be of service. Simply put, studies demonstrate this is good for us. We are biologically hardwired to be of service. When we go back to nomadic tribal states, we knew that if our partner or one of our tribe members was looked after, and that tribe member had great strength and resilience, emotional, psychological, namely physical and spiritual, then the chances of our survival were increased because we had that support and we were able to support each other. Strength in numbers. And that biological hardwiring, that self-preservation, that mechanism of self-preservation comes from that. Being of service is beneficial. We learn about who we are. We learn about our value, our personal currency through actively being of service, through deep intention and through attention to self. It's culturally beneficial, it's socially beneficial, because we're able to assist others in living their truth and expressing their empowered states. Next, identify your personal principles and then live them, live with them and live by them. Now, your personal principles, part of that are your values and purpose, but beyond that, we're talking about psycho-emotional values. So, do you value morality? Do you value ethics? Do you value integrity, honesty, truth, sincerity? What are your personal principles, your personal values? Discover these, connect to these. Part of that is, how do you wish to treat others for the sake of treating others? And how do you wish to be treated as well? And when you can identify that you wish to be treated with complete respect and dignity and 100% prowess, then guess what happens? You live those principles, you find meaning and fulfillment in life. You discover that, you live that. That leads us to happiness. In happy states, we are able to be connected to self. We are able to recognize our self-worth immensely. Now, how powerful is that? Next point, and there's 4 or 5 to go. Diversify your experiences. Try something new. Expose yourself to a multitude of varying experiences to know what resonates with you and connect to and excel at and find comfort and connection to these experiences. That comfort breeds familiarity, that familiarity breeds safety, but it also breeds a sense of knowing. And the more we know ourselves, the more we value ourselves, the more worth we are able to perceive in ourselves. You see, when we diversify our experiences, see, in natural ecology, biodiversity in any environment or any natural ecology is healthy for that organism, for that macroorganism, as it is for us as well. But through the diversity and experience, we learn about what we value, what's important to us and what's not. And then when we live those values, when we live that truth, when we live those actions, we find worth in ourselves for doing so, because we're actually stepping into courage and being the most authentic version of ourselves. And diversifying actively with intent and attention to self, diversifying our experiences allows us to do that. Next point, for cultivating self-awareness. Set personal targets for yourself. Internalize ways of being and also externalize targets. There's nothing wrong with that. It's when we become too obsessed with the external and we begin to globally compare that we lose touch of reality. And the reality I'm referring to is that intrinsic state, that state of being. Who do you wish to be in the world? Begin small, then immerse in both doing and being, and reflect on the feelings that come from living in that sacred space. Reflect on the feelings, so introspection, but also reflect on the thoughts that come with that as well. And I recommend to start small, because I don't want you to burn yourself out or set yourself such immensely challenging targets that you lose touch of the possibility of being very real with who you are. Next point, third last point. Focus on what is working in life. So in my online programs, I have a lesson called What is Working in Life? And it assists us in shifting our perspective from purely negative to a more balanced, equilibrated state of understanding the world around us and our models of reality. Meaning that we focus on what is actually working in life. Where do we find refuge? Where do we find meaning, happiness, contentment? Where do we find understanding, connection, value? And the more we do this, the more we're able to connect ourselves to what is working, and the fact that we are responsible, at least in part, whereas through a co-creation process at the very minimum, we are responsible for being a part of what is working in our lives. And therefore, our sense of self-worth is increased. And that's a beautiful place to be. Next point. Know that the past does not equate to the present. Understanding this, that we needn't be defined by our past actions, is critical in building self-confidence, in understanding self, in recognizing our worth. We are going to make choices in life that don't always resonate with those around us and don't always resonate with ourselves, our journey, our path, and that are not at that time the healthiest choices to make. We're going to hurt others, we're going to hurt ourselves. It doesn't mean we have to repeat, we are destined or we are doomed to repeat those choices over and over again, because we are not. We are not destined or doomed to repeat those choices. We can learn and we can grow. And through that growth process, through that learning, guess what happens? We are able to be the best version of self. We are able to recognize our value and our contribution to the world. And the fact that we can learn and grow, that's contribution. That's power. And lastly, we mentioned this earlier, wanting to redefine failure and fear, but in particularly failure. You see, if we see or we observe failure as totally, completely negative and that there is no value in failure, we're setting ourselves up for disaster, because guess what? We're going to set objectives and targets for ourselves and we're not going to meet them. This is life and this is okay. Remember, success is defined by the process primarily, not by reaching a desired or initially stated outcome. We must redefine failure as something of great value, because when we do that, we redefine our sense of self-worth. We redefine who we are. Redefine failure and we redefine our self-worth. That's an empowered state to step into. A deeply, deeply empowered state to step into. So what are the benefits, the overall benefits of cultivating self-awareness? Well, the overall benefits of cultivating self-awareness, are an ability to connect to self, an ability to connect to others, an ability to believe in self, to know self, to love self, to live fully, openly, experientially, to live with such open eyes and wonder. How exciting is that? But when we back ourselves, we do more of that. We take more action in that area that interests us, that we align with, that we value, that is part of our purpose. So we find greater meaning in life. We cultivate greater levels of happiness, greater levels of self-worth. It's a win-win. People then become inspired by that. So if we were to ask how to assist others in feeling self-worth, be you, be authentically you, live your truth. Those points that I've just mentioned now about cultivating self-awareness, just do that, be that, live in that space, and you will assist others in cultivating feelings of self-worth in themselves, because they will be inspired by who you are deeply. Now, I want to leave you with some key questions to ask yourselves, people, really key questions. And there's a few here, and it's so important that we connect to this. I'm going to run through these questions, and I'm going to allow you to, of course, reflect introspectively, deeply on these and really connect to them. Number one, what does self-worth mean to you? How do you define or assess self-worth? Is there a general measurement of worth that holds true for everyone? So is there an objective measurement of self-worth, or is it quite personalised and subjective, or is it a combination of both? What is your personal currency? Back to that original question. What can you offer the world and yourself, your own life journey? Do you even consider your worth at all? Is it something that enters the sphere of your consciousness? How can you be of service to others and to the evolution of self, to your own path? What is your why? Why are you here on earth? Are the reasons you deem yourself worthy of existing disproportionately linked to externalities? Or can you trace your self-worth to some internal certainties? Powerful question. What are your strengths? Where are you resilient in life? What is working in life? What are you grateful for? What are your greatest talents? And finally, what inspires you deeply? If you ask these questions daily of yourself, because the quality of the questions we ask ourselves determine the quality of the life that we live and the quality of the outcomes that we experience, you will transmute, you will transform, you will be a very different person to someone that is not confident, that is not connected, that is not loving, that is not aware of self, that is not engaged deeply in self, that has a low sense of self-worth. I almost beg you to ask these questions. Connect to these questions, connect to self. Know self deeply, love self completely. When you do this, you change the course of history, not only for yourself, but for others, for those that are in your life. And that becomes profoundly inspiring and profoundly life transformative for you and for everybody else's life that you touch and the lives that they touch. I'm going to leave you with that, people. I'm going to say thank you so much for watching, for participating, for being a part of this webinar, for engaging, for thinking, for contemplating, for being present. Thank you so much. Many blessings on your journey. I look forward to seeing you next week for the 10th tenet of the sovereign leadership, of the authentic self model, not the sovereign leadership model. And I shall see you soon. Be brilliant, be well, be amazing. Many blessings. Take care. Thank you so much.